everybody, and welcome to another episode of Elixir Mix. This week on our panel, we have Mark Ericksen.
Hey, friends.
Josh Adams.
Hello.
We have a special guest host, Michael Ries.
Hi, everybody.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and we have a special guest, Johnny Winn. Johnny, do you want to say hi?
Greetings, everybody. How are y'all doing?
I ran into you at CodeBeam San Francisco. We got to talking, and I thought it'd be fun to have you on the show, talk about some of the stuff that you've done in the Elixir community since, Elixir Fountain, a bunch of other stuff. So, I'm not sure. I'm going to let the panel decide where they want to start. This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
All right. I know Josh can certainly do this too, but I just want to kick off a little bit. Just saying, we have the Elixir community is growing, right? We have a lot of new people coming in. And if you haven't been in the Elixir community for a while, there are some podcasts and conferences and things that have been around and Johnny was instrumental in and a part of. And you ran the Elixir Fountain podcast. I was a regular listener. And so I appreciated, it was an interview type show where you talk with people and kind of get their insight, what they're doing. And we're kind of doing the same type of thing here. It's like we're bringing in panelists and getting insight. And so I just wanted to thank you for having had that long run of kind of establishing that. It was a great place for me to start hearing the things as I was learning Elixir, kind of getting the concepts and hearing some of the things that you were doing when you'd present at conferences. So yeah, so maybe you should just first start off with Elixir Fountain and where you're at with that.
Well, first of all, you can blame Josh, by the way, for all this. This is all his fault. We have a nice history of, what was it? It was RubyConf Miami, which was 2013, I think it was. I had given in my first talk on Elixir, and he came up to me. He was like one of the 3 people that came up to me after the talk, and we started chatting. He's like, "You should do a newsletter." I was like, "What? Nobody's going to read a newsletter." He's like, "Oh, no, I'll subscribe." And I said, "All right." So I started a newsletter called the Elixir Fountain, and I did that for, I don't know, it was probably about a year and a half. And Jose had actually kind of approached me because it was really hard to find stories. The community was so young at the time, and it's kind of funny. I've almost kind of equated it to when you're young and you're in high school and you have that group of friends. That's kind of what the Elixir community felt like in the beginning. There was I'm sure there was more, but it felt like there was 10 of us and we all knew each other and we all talked on a pretty regular basis and things like that. And we all kind of knew what each other were doing, but outside that circle, nobody really knew what was going on. And so starting the newsletter was a way of kind of engaging people. And one of the stories, I know I've probably told it before. If you're an Elixir Fountain listener, you probably heard it about the My Elixir status hashtag. And that was a total hack. The idea behind that was I couldn't find the articles. I was having difficulty. So what I did was I started asking people, go ahead and tweet with My Elixir status, and that'll basically it was a cheat so that I could find people. Or find articles to post. And then when Jose approached me about them doing the Elixir Radar, I was like, okay, yeah, no, hey, it's your language. It totally makes sense for you guys to do the newsletter. And so, I kind of took a step back and I was like, well, there was a ton of people following the Elixir Fountain. It seemed like a waste just to let it die. And I reached out to Josh and I said, Josh, I'm thinking about doing a podcast. What do you think? And he said, do it. Go do it. I said, is anybody really going to listen? And he's like, oh yeah, I'll listen. Damn it, Josh. 3 years later.
So you created the newsletter and the podcast just with the idea that you're talking to Josh.
Basically, yeah. It all boils down to me having a conversation with Josh. And
I read and listened.
Yeah, now we know Josh is the voice in Johnny's head.
Yes.
basically, yeah. So, but no, I mean, it's been fun. Yeah, it's been about a year since we've done an episode. In part, the last episode we had Sasha Jurich on it and Lance Halverson, and it was a great episode. We got a lot of good feedback on it. And at the time, I was kind of going through some kind of like personal, like just feeling beat up all around. You know, I know we had moved to Colorado. The company I was with at the time was asking a lot of my time. It was getting harder and harder to feel, and I was starting to just not feel creative. And, you know, I know Charles has done shows for years. There does kind of come a point where you feel like you've said the things. And yes, there's new stuff to talk about, but sometimes you're like, geez, I've had this conversation 100 times now. Do I want to have
shows?
Exactly. You know, and it got to the point where like I would talk to, oh, remember when you said this thing? No, I really don't. I'm sure I guarantee I said it. It's recorded somewhere, so I'm sure I can go back and find it. But no, I don't. They all kind of blend in to one big conversation, and that's kind of where my head was at the time. Where like I was feeling very overwhelmed, and like just so much, and so I had to step back. And then, like I said, it's been about a year, but you know, I've changed scenery. Things are starting to, you know, get back. I'm starting to get back involved, you know, obviously with the Elixir Fountain, but there's also Elixir Days, which is the conference that we've hosted. It was the first regional Elixir conference back in St. Augustine, Florida. That was 2015. I think it was the first year we did that. So it's, you know, it's been a while. I'm doing a lot of things, speaking a lot and stuff like that. So trying to get back involved more.
I'll just say from my perspective, kind of similar to what Mark said earlier, you know, those, especially the earliest episodes of the Elixir Fountain, for me came at a time when I had a lot of personal interest in the language, and there wasn't a lot of other people I could find near me that shared that interest. And so going to work every day and just kind of being surrounded by a different community, but feeling like I had this lifeline. So I'm curious now, as you're starting to kind of, it sounds like you're kind of getting back into this creative phase again. Do you think that going back to a podcast, is that something that we can look forward to? Or do you think you're going to find other venues for that kind of community contribution that you want to make?
I don't know. I got to ask Josh.
I think that you ought to look into raising horses, honestly.
Get out of the podcast business.
Podcast about raising horses, clearly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, you know, there's a lot of things that I want to get involved in. I've talked about doing the podcast again. I mean, every time I go to a conference, I have people come up to me and say, oh, you know, hey, you know, it got me into Elixir, or, you know, I got so much out of the show. And so I feel like it's kind of like the same thing with the newsletter. Like, I feel like, yeah, to a lot of people, I reached out and introduced people to them that maybe they didn't know were in the community or things like that. And, you know, introduced language or libraries and stuff like that, and try to keep things going. But at the same time, it goes back to that. I feel like I've had that same conversation. And so if, you know, that the plan is to start back up at some sort of cadence, but maybe change it up a little bit. One of the things that I've been always kind of drew me to Elixir to start with is that experimental, pushing the boundaries sort of things that kind of came with the language. You know, I don't know about y'all, but Elixir was the first language that I was introduced to that I was there about as close to the beginning as possible. And I've been using it this whole time. And so you really see it grow and you see it change, but there was so much experimentation in the beginning because nothing existed for it. You know, it was like you had to, if you wanted a library to even parse dates, because all you had was Erlang dates, you had to figure it out, you know, and we're getting to a maturity level in the language right now where there's so much built, but my fear is that we get complacent and we lose that curiosity, that like, you know, innovation that kind of is what started Elixir and kind of grew in those early days. You know, pushing the boundaries. And so one of the things that I've kind of thought about doing is maybe more along the lines of, some type of screencast sort of thing where like we put together a project that's a ridiculously unnecessary project, and apply constraints that we have to stick to certain constraints that force us into using OTP. This is actually something that I'm doing in my day job. I work at Weedmaps, great company to work for. Yes, we are hiring, obviously. But, one of the things that we do is like a lunch and learn thing, and we're getting it started where, we come up with an exercise. A lot of them are initially inspired by exercises for programmers by Brian Hogan, which is a prog book I highly recommend checking out. And what we did was we took them and then kind of like took a couple of them, change the constraints up a bit to require you to do things that you wouldn't necessarily do. Like one of them, in it suggests making a web application. Well, the first rule we have is you can't use Phoenix. You can use anything else, but you can't use Phoenix. And not that there's anything wrong with Phoenix, but you don't want to get complacent. You don't want to say, oh, well, if I need to do something, this is my go-to tool. Well, how does that work? Well, why don't you write it in plug and kind of see what some of the underlying kind of middleware sort of things work? Or why don't you check out Rax, which is also a great library, that's kind of like a web framework type library, but it gives you those other options. One of the exercises that we're talking about doing that I'm thinking about walking through is a command line chat app. So that the whole purpose is to create multiple nodes, with one of them being a centralized node to route traffic around the chat app. But then you have separate nodes that start up that are the quote unquote clients, so, little experimental projects like that. Not anything that you're going to use necessarily practically or push it into production, but just explore the language a little bit. Keep that curiosity there.
Do you
I want to
think
see more stuff with Scenic generally?
Scenic does seem very cool.
Yeah, I would +1 anything you do around Scenic. But I'm also curious from your standpoint, as I listen to that, I'm thinking a little bit about kind of the natural hype cycle and maturity cycle that comes around languages. And I think there's some natural evolution that happens with the language like Elixir, where it's nice to have some things built for you. And I'm wondering, is this desire to kind of explore a little bit more, do you like to personally do that more out of a sense of learning? Is it part of the excitement of doing something new or doing it for yourself? Where do you think that desire comes from?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that there's that part of me that I like to break the rules.
Rage against the hex package.
Exactly. So, and there's people doing great work on libraries. Don't get me wrong. I mean, obviously I use libraries in my day to day. And if I want, if I'm doing something in production where, it's always better to probably grab, I would grab Ecto over rolling my own, although I say that. And Rob Connery and I did kind of roll our own core. but it's also, it was only in production in a couple of places. But in any case, it also stems from like the way I learned programming. I learned on my own. I was basically in a bubble, and I didn't really, and I got started learning like Perl and PHP and just kind of whatever kind of suited my fancy. And it was like on the job training. Somebody would come and say, hey, look, we want this thing. And I didn't really know what to do. So most of the time I just assumed you wrote it yourself. And even then, once I kind of got out of, writing CGI scripts in Perl, which was fun. One time I did a Oracle to Postgres migration before Postgres was actually like a good web database. Needless to say, that was not as much fun as you think. But we got, it was one of the things, if you needed something, you wrote it. It wasn't, and even once I got into like .NET, and I did .NET development for probably about close to 10 years, you really kind of wrote your own stuff because everything was proprietary. So if you wanted to use a library, you had to pay out of pocket to use it, or you could write your own thing. Open source wasn't, and it wasn't that it was non-existent. It just wasn't the commonplace in .NET world.
I will say it was basically non-existent. I was a .NET developer.
Exactly.
I was too. And those were expensive package.
Oh yeah, they weren't cheap. The Infragistics library.
Oh yeah.
Oh. And every time you got a new client that needed it, it was always they had always changed things up just enough to where you had to relearn it a little bit. It was a nightmare. But then when I got into Ruby, as much as I liked Ruby, everything was Ruby had already matured to the point. Rails had already matured to the point where there was a lot of libraries. The dependency graph for Rails applications is insane.
Not quite as bad as NPM, but it gets close.
Exactly.
You mean Express, just to be comparable, not directly comparable, but yes.
Well,
and what's funny is Rails uses bundler, so you get like one instance of the same library. And with NPM, you get wacky stuff with different versions of different things, and it's getting better, but it's still anyway.
But what was the library that they all of a sudden decided they deleted?
Left pad.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like the perfect example of why you just write something yourself.
I totally agree. Now, I mean, there are certain things that I really do appreciate that is now in the community. Like you mentioned dates, like you had to kind of roll your own dates. It's like, well, they've kind of come up with the core teams like that. We have a good solution around that now. And I'm really grateful for that I don't have to do that. Time zones are still stupid and hard, but I can deal with that.
I think
a lot of it is like, I don't want to, I don't like pulling in a library when really, if you go look into the library source to see how they're doing something, there's like one or two lines that's like, oh, that's the secret sauce I needed. And
well, so speaking both about dates and rolling your own, I will say that on the Elm community, there, obviously we all have a standard way that everyone deals with dates, which is you pass around ISO strings and everybody's happy and hopefully use UTC in the database and whatever. But in the Elm community, Evan has a history of just not taking any prior art whatsoever when it comes to things like that. And he pointed out, makes a really compelling argument that I'm going to apply everywhere, which is, hey, why are we passing around strings for dates? And so the default is a POSIX time because it's a UTC POSIX time, and that's just it. And now you're not sending a string and then parsing and unparsing on both sides. It's crazy that we do that when you actually think about it. But if you just grab a library and go with it, you would just continue the status quo.
Yeah, it's actually, I think my favorite thing about dates, James Fish Cakes said at CodeBeam, the thing about time zones is they're always changing. But the thing about, we had talking about the libraries specifically, we had a case at the company I was with a while back where we were running into a performance problem. And we started like analyzing chunks of the code and saying, okay, well, where's the bottleneck? What is, and try using Benchy to try to figure out, like, we'd run this and everything's fine. Well, then we got to, we were using the calendar library and we decided, well, surely it can't be there because that's a library that's tested. It's an open source library. It's, community supported. Somebody would have thought it was a problem. It was the bottleneck. And the reason was, and honestly, I think it was in part because of the way we were using it in this chunk of code. I don't necessarily think it was the library. I think it was a combination of it's a slow thing to do because we were shifting time zones. But we realized it was shifting time zones every time it was trying to read over this set. And so that it was adding just a second or so to each request. And when you're dealing with tens of thousands of records, that adds up real quick. And so, yeah, but we were just doing something that we just needed to not do. But a lot of times with libraries, I find that if you, to your point, Mark, like if you go in and look and say, okay, well, this is this one bit of functionality. One of my libraries, Inflex, is the perfect example of that. So Inflex was a library that I created in the very early days with Phoenix, because Chris and I had talked, and there was the whole inflection and active support for doing like things like shifting pluralization. And so Rails controllers used to be, or I don't know if they still are. I haven't looked at a Rails controller in a long time, but they used to be pluralized. And so when we first started talking about that, we did pluralized controller names. And so that was so I wrote Inflex to do pluralization and then singularization. And then, well, why don't we do parameterization. And it was starting to kind of do all these things. And there's a lot of people that use it. But Jose came into the project, into Phoenix, and he was like, well, why are we having this whole library for just this one function that we need? And so they just put the function in. And then they started thinking about, like, well, why are we even pluralizing these things? We're pluralizing them because they were done this way in this other library that has nothing to do with us. And so I think they ended up just scrapping the whole thing. And like the one function that they needed, they ended up removing. And so it is kind of that like evolution of like, do we need a library for it? Is this something that I can just write once here? I've got also I don't know if y'all have seen was it The Art of Software or The Art of Destroying Software by Greg Young. It's a talk from a while back. And
Phenomenal.
It is a phenomenal talk. I highly recommend it. But it makes it okay to, dry isn't the be all end all solution. It's like we get obsessed with drying this code up and having this single thing. And then what ends up happening is it's so abstracted out that it almost becomes unusable and unmanageable, because now if you make a change to it, you don't know where all it's affecting. Whereas if you just write the function right there where you need it, it's okay. I think there was a conversation I was kind of having with somebody that was talking about extracting a bunch of date stuff, so believe it or not, into a single library that could be shared across a bunch of different applications. Well, what happens when I want to use dates? I want to format date a little bit different. It was about formatting dates, and so, well, I want to format date. Well, then you're going to have to pass in what kind of form. Well, then why bother doing the function at all? Just write the function where you need it in the application that you need it, and use and parse the date the way you want to see it parsed. So.
Note to self, next time I need some date parsing or formatting, I know just the person to talk to. I got to say, though, I love this conversation. One of the things that actually drew me to the Erlang community before I got into Elixir was this feeling of kind of pragmatism or practicality above all else. And you can take that virtue to an extreme, right? You can take it to the point where you're like, oh, we don't need a standard tool for managing dependencies. Right? We don't really care that much about semantic version. We'll just pull in Git dependencies. And, and maybe you take it too far, like, oh, we just don't need any of this stuff. And if it goes too far, then you end up with some tools that aren't the best to work with every day. But I do really love that sense that I still find in the Elixir community. And there's a wide spectrum of how people feel on this topic. But, I have a little bit of scar tissue around having to scale some Ruby systems. And we would find things like, there was a time that we found one of the major libraries that was, it was around session management. And they had a global lock just in the middle of the code. It had been there for years and years. No one had really found it because most people are running MRI, which doesn't really have threads. And no one had really done a lot of benchmarking around it, because benchmarking is not that big of a deal in the Ruby community. It's not a major value that the community embraces.
We already know it's slow.
Yeah, exactly. You already know it's slow. Why would you bother benchmarking it? And I love the fact, though, that also a lot of times if I go look at an Elixir package, I'll see one or two benchmarks. But if I ask someone how to parse a date, I won't get back 45 different Stack Overflow responses, all with different proofs about what big O notation guarantees they provide or whatever. And sometimes languages go way too far in that. And so for me, I've really loved in the Elixir community this sense of pragmatism, and even to the point, like you mentioned, Johnny, of, hey, we were doing this thing and we just kind of asked ourselves, like, we Marie Kondoed our own tool set and just said, do we really need this package? Do we really need to automatically pluralize or singularize things in our framework? Well, if we just write the module name, we don't. Let's just not do it. And, let's just keep the things that bring us joy in our code.
Well, I think, I was going to say, I think that one of the things that we do have to ask ourselves as developers is why. Like, why are we doing this? Are we doing it because that's the way it's always been done? Are we doing this because this is what we need? We're solving a particular problem. And, I think so many times when we kind of go, it's funny. I think the answer to why a lot of times is depends. the greatest, there you go, right there's the whole show, Charles. The greatest question developers can ask ourselves is why. The perfect answer for that question is it depends. There. But that's, that is part of the, why are we using these things? Why did we pull this library in? Do we need this library? And maybe we do, maybe we don't. Maybe it is something that we would rather maintain ourselves. And that way we have more control over it. We don't, I think Calliope, which is a Haml parser I wrote back in the early day, so Chris McCord and I both used to use Haml and so the idea was that, well, why don't we write a view engine? Because at the time Phoenix didn't have a view engine. And so the idea, I'm very much a specialized tools, like, hey, the Haml parser should contain the view engine. It should do the thing. You just bring it into your application and it works. And so I had written it. Well, part of the reason why I did it was because at the time I was working at a company called HashRocket, which is a Rails consultancy, and all our designers wanted to use Haml, but they used like Haml the way that they like to use Haml. So when I wrote the Haml parser, I wrote it based on their specifications. Like how are they using Haml? I'm going to parse basically their Haml documents. And then I made the mistake of releasing it out to the public. Oh, yes. Everybody told me how I was doing it wrong. That, well, Angular was the big one. Like most people could make it work for their own flavor of Haml, but apparently Angular has some things that for whatever reason, did not like the library at all. And I was like, PR's accepted. It's not, it's not something that the library is going to do, because it's not something. Now, that being said, going back and look, I probably did it the absolute worst way you could write a language parser, because I used regexes, which made it way difficult to deal with. Now, and a funny side story to that is I don't really maintain it. I kind of passed it over to Steve Palin, who did the Elixir admin tool, because I stopped using Haml. I went to using HTML if I was going to do front end work, and most of the work that I do now is on back end work or like APIs. So I don't even use HTML or Haml. And so I kind of, passed it off to him. And then I don't know, I think every once in a while somebody will say something on it, but for the most part, it's like, PR accepted. If you want to keep using it, that's great. More power to you, but, it's just not something that's on my radar right now.
So I'm curious, overall, what kinds of systems are you building today with Elixir? And also, what kinds of systems would you like to work on in Elixir?
So currently, in my current team I'm working on, we work on a lot of like back-end systems at Winn Maps that kind of do some of the centralizing of actions, I guess. So you have a lot of external services that are kind of interacting, and the team that I'm on, we actually build the internal systems that are servicing many different applications. An example being like a policies application to make sure that there's a central policies or features turned on and turned off for various applications. And I don't think it's necessarily, and one of the companies I was at, we were building virtual power plants, which was fun. It was kind of cool. But to me, it's not so much the domain, it's the scale. So solving scalability issues, solving latency issues with services and things like that. Like, how can I make this faster? How can I make this as fast as possible with the least amount of code? Those are the kind of problems I like to solve. And, in my side stuff, when I'm working kind of on my own, I just like to experiment, see what's out there, find a cool problem. I know, like a talk that I gave a few years ago on genetics. So I've always been kind of interested in genetics. And so I was like, you know what, I'm going to take a deep dive in genetics I even took a course on Coursera on genetics, like an intro to genetics course to sit through. It was like a 6-week course or something like that to kind of get more knowledge on it so that I could then step back and build something in it. There was actually, there's several kind of evolution simulation type games out there, like written in various things where you can set like fitness and set optimal characteristics and stuff like that. And then you can generate a species or multiple species. And then that's cool. Like, that has nothing to do with scale necessarily. I mean, yeah, I guess you could have a few hundred thousand species or something like that. But I mean, it's not necessarily like it goes back to that. It's not changing the world sort of thing, but it's an interesting problem to learn more about, and see how you can take a language that you're already interested in and learn more about it. And then, because what I find is you learn enough from solving those problems, even though it's not like a 1-to-1 with your day job. When you encounter something in your day job that could benefit from some of the things that you learn, multi-nodes or, learning OTP through genetics, stuff like that. And sometimes it's as much about learning what you shouldn't do as what you should do.
This episode is brought to you by Triplebyte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume. You spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, Triplebyte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. Triplebyte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/elixir. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through Triplebyte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
I used to be kind of hesitant about like what I put in GitHub, because I'm always afraid, you stick something in GitHub and you push it up there and it's a public repo and somebody sees it and they're like, oh, I should do it this way. No, that's my, I'm not telling you should. I'm telling you that's what I did here in this particular case. So it is always one of those like fine balances, but like what do you make public? But I think everybody should experiment. I think everybody should push the bounds of what a language can do, or what, pretty much anything you're working on, whether it's a language or a framework or, even a pattern. Even if you see a particular pattern of like, how can I optimize this to be theoretically correct? Because let's be honest, I mean, even if you take something like MVC, it's been butchered so many times in so many different ways. To go back to what it was originally is completely, it's object-oriented. Joe Armstrong will tell you, Erlang is the most object-oriented language out there. It is all about message passing, so, go back to the root of things and take a look at it and push those boundaries. I mean, that's the biggest takeaway that I can get from my time with Elixir, is that it was all about pushing boundaries and seeing what you could do. Whether or not you should do it or not is a different story.
Yeah, pushing stupid boundaries is actually how I got into Erlang and Elixir in the first place, because I was at the time heavily into Ruby, and I had a project that I said, you know what, I'm going to get 100% test coverage on this. I know I shouldn't. I'm going to do it anyway. And so I did, but it required a whole lot of injecting dependencies, right? And so then my next project, my next little side project, I decided I was going to have sort of top-level dependency injection, and nothing else could know about any other module. Everything had to be told about everything it was interacting with. And it was great. And then I was discussing it with Brian Hunter, and he said, it sounds an awful lot like you just want to be doing functional programming, and I'm not sure why you're not. And it was, I couldn't help but appreciate the wisdom of that. So that got me into Erlang, just because it came from Brian, and I'd wanted to look into Erlang in the first place. And then that led to Elixir. So, and it was stupid. Don't try for 100% test coverage. But sometimes you do a stupid thing, you learn something you enjoy.
I think I've got you on the stupid things I've written. I wrote this application called the TARDIS, which this was like one of the first talks I gave. It was a Ruby application that was completely based on metaprogramming. And the idea was that it would kind of parse what you told it, and it would write an application based on. So like if you could say, give me a class named so-and-so that has 3 functions named this, and this, and it would build the application in memory. And then you could then call those functions and do the things that you told it to do. It was the dumbest project that I have, but I learned so much about metaprogramming in Ruby. It was fun.
If we're discussing dumb projects, I built a library in Elixir called Mechanical Turk down that will do markdown parsing by way of Mechanical Turk and block until someone submits an answer.
But those are the best projects to work on. I mean, come on, everybody would go around the table. So, something stupid that you wrote that was fun. Nobody else has those? Is it just us?
Well, I mean, actually, one of my earliest memories in the Elixir community, I wrote like a little SVG generator, and I needed to play around with code eval, and I wanted to try to make it safe and ask some questions. I think this is before the Elixir forum. I think I asked it on the mailing list when there was the mailing list. But I remember being so proud because when I actually published it, like I tweeted about, I found the answer to the thing that I was looking for about how to do this safely. And I actually got retweeted because I used the My Elixir status, speaking of that little history. And it was funny, the level of impact that had on me, right? That even though I had written this thing that was just for fun, and it was just a way of kind of like specifying an SVG using kind of Elixir data structures, you're really not doing a whole lot there other than it did implement macros, which it didn't need to, but it did, just because I wanted to know how macros worked. And then some people actually drew some pretty cool pieces of art with it, this panda with crazy shaking eyes and stuff. And it was an amazing project. I think you're totally right. There's something that's magical about the learning process when you make it explicit play, right? When you tell your brain, oh, I'm just exploring, I just want to bump into something new. It lets your brain do things that it doesn't do when you have a deadline and when you have a budget.
Well, and I know I'm going to say something here that's probably going to be super controversial, but when I'm doing that too, a lot of times I don't use tests. I'll just, I don't know what I'm writing. I have no idea, so that's the beautiful thing about IEX. Load it up and start calling functions and see what they do and see what you expect and see how you want to craft it. I mean, a lot of times, now that's not to say what I do at like my day job. Obviously, I'm going to try. But there's even times where before I write my first test, I play around and I start writing code and kind of, start with single module or something like that and just kind of craft some code, see what it's like, understand what I'm trying to build and my expectations from the code that I'm going to get. And then I start writing tests saying that, okay, I'm going to meet this expectation. This is, because a lot of times you don't really know what you need to build. And I've always really envied people that they can write a whole test suite without any code and then all of a sudden write an application. It's like, wow, damn.
Well, I think you can only do that if you really understand the problem, which means you've probably done it before, which means it's probably nothing new and exciting.
Exactly. Oh yeah. And that's the thing is if you know what you're doing, yeah, sure. Write the test, go through it and do it. But I mean, those are, I like to solve other problems. I like to solve the ones I don't know how to do. Those are the ones that keep things interesting.
So my crazy project, I'll throw this one in. I did it in Ruby, but it was a command line tool that would connect to Twitter and pull down a tweet and execute it in Ruby. And I was working on having it look for a specific hashtag so that you could actually search for other people's Ruby tweets.
Nice.
I actually finished it. And it's a dumb idea because you could execute something that did some terrible things to you.
You need a sandbox for that.
RubyRoulette.com.
Exactly.
But it was fun getting it to connect to the Twitter APIs and all that stuff.
Well, and I think you gain so much knowledge just from experimenting like that, from learning. It keeps I know I kind of mentioned earlier on the show about like the kind of burnout phase. I think that's probably part of what led to my burnout was I wasn't having the time to do those experimental projects. I wasn't having, a lot of times I do, conference driven development where, I submit a talk about a topic that I really think is cool and that I want to talk about. And then I learn it. The genetics one was a perfect example. It's something I really was interested in. I submitted a talk, it got accepted, and I was like, oh, shoot, I need to now learn more about genetics and more about how I'm going to do this. But I think, that's kind of one of those things as a developer that leads to your burnout, that repetition of doing the same thing day in and day out and not having the time to push boundaries, not having the time to experiment or explore. I know, and for those, everybody else is .NET developers, like when I was doing .NET development, I was like, well, should I learn another language or should I do that? Oh, there's so much to do in .NET world. You could spend a career learning all the different, avenues and stuff like this. But it was really freeing when I got to Ruby that like the culture in Ruby was about like, I worked with people that were into all sorts of different languages, at some point Erlang got in there and Go and Clojure and, just a variety of things. And it was very exploratory. And I took a step back and I tried to figure out why. And I realized that, a lot of the people that were doing Ruby at the time, I think Ruby's popularity is enough. There's a lot of people coming into programming straight into Ruby. But at the time, most everybody that was doing Ruby at a high level had come from another language. They had all come from either Java or .NET or something else. And so they'd already made the jump. So then you come into Ruby and now you've already kind of got that like antsy sort of, I'm not necessarily looking out for the next thing, but I want to explore other things. You've got that exploratory kind of, and that's what a lot of like the early adopters of Elixir, it kind of felt the same way. A lot of them were coming from Ruby. And I think it's because a lot of them had already made the jump from another language at some point. And so they were already like, hey, what's the next thing? What's out there, and constantly trying to challenge themselves to learn. And that's not to say that there's not Java developers and .NET developers that don't challenge themselves and do great work. It's just, I think that it's taking a step back from being a developer. I think it's something in us as people that is like, on to the next thing. I think I've told a few people about this, but there was a friend of mine had introduced me to this article back in high school about the cat lifestyle. And it's, everybody knows cats, right? Cat does something until it's bored and then it goes and finds something else to do. And the idea is that how that translates to your life, you do something until you're bored with it and then you go do something else. And honestly, like I didn't start out as a developer. I started out, for one, I was going to be a rock star. I was going to be a musician. When that didn't quite pan out and the band broke up, I got into culinary and I worked my way up to head chef. And then I kind of reached the point where I was like, I'm over it. And I dropped it and got into computers and I did CAD work actually the funny story about the CAD work, and some of you may have heard it, but it's like, I started a college, like a vocational school to learn how to do CAD. I took my first class. I got my first job. I worked in it for 2 years and I was in a 2-year vocational program. So by the time I had graduated from this 2-year vocational program, I had spent 2 years working in CAD and I was already on to something else. So that was what we like to refer to as a waste of money. I'm still paying on that. But the one thing about programming that really attracted me and has allowed me to do this for almost 20 years now is, because we're in 2019, I got started around 2000. One thing that has let me do this is there's always something new to explore, whether or not you're changing jobs and changing domains or changing languages or just learning something new. There's always something right there that you can take. You can always take something and learn something new or change up what you're doing. So I think that's one of the really nice things about being a developer.
So Johnny, one of the things we kind of touched on in that discussion was burnout and kind of recognizing when it might be like the symptoms perhaps, but like you have as having come through this and you're like now coming on the upside, like is any advice that you would have for developers to say how they might identify it in themselves before it starts to crash? So they might take some corrective measures, or just like what you found to be helpful for you in kind of helping to lift it out.
I think it's weird. It is one of those things we always say, hindsight is 20/20. Like looking back, I can kind of see like, oh wow, no, I was going down a slippery slope. You don't feel yourself sliding, and you just think, oh, I'm working, if I get to this one point, I just got to get to this next weekend. And, and one thing I realized too is that like, as I was going through my weeks, like right now at my current job, Friday comes and I'm like, oh shoot, it's Friday. I still have more stuff I want to get done. Whereas I was in a cycle where Monday would come and I'm like, how many days till Friday? Like at 7:00 Monday morning, and I realized like I kind of stopped taking care of myself as much. I stopped working out. I stopped eating right, and you start going into cycles like that where you start eating junk food. And then I think what really got me is talking to my wife. She's like, you just don't seem happy. Like even when you're happy, quote unquote, you don't seem happy, like it's like always just like it's almost like this cloud kind of carries around with you. And it does help. I mean, I'm sure it's probably a lot harder if you're like single, because it's easy to kind of get stuck in a rut when you're single and you don't have anybody to say, hey, something's not right. Whereas, I'm lucky I have my wife and my kids. And so they kind of are like, hey, something's off. You're not yourself, it's like, and I mean, because my wife always, she jokes that, when my plate is full, I take one thing off and put 3 more back on. Can you tell? Podcast, speaking, travel, conference, all that kind of stuff. It's like I always seem to throw something else on, and I have a hard time saying no. Like if somebody asks me, hey, can you do this or can you help? Yes, I can do that. I'll figure it out. Knowing that at some point I'm going to get overwhelmed and kind of throw my hands up in the air. But I think this time was weird is I never threw my hands up in the air. I never said, that's it. I've got to let all the chips just fall where they fall. And I think just having that conversation with my wife and just having her be like, you're just not happy. You're here, but you're not here. And realizing what's funny is coming out of it. I think that was, oh man, it's like this cloud, just all of a sudden the skies open up and you feel better. You feel like that weight is lifted off your shoulder. And it's like I said, I wasn't feeling creative. So if you start like, to me, like going into this again, if I start feeling like I'm not being creative or I'm not there in the moment, because I'm very much an in the moment sort of person anyway. Whatever's around me at the time is my life. I know that sounds weird to say because it's like, oh, of course it is, but I'm not nostalgic. I'm not always looking to the future. I'm very much living in the present, and I don't tie myself to things or stuff like that too much. Actually, there's a joke about that. We went to move. My wife is like, you need to pack up all your stuff. I said, okay. So I got a box that's, you can't see my hands, but it was about maybe 9 inches by 9 inches and about 6 inches deep. I threw a handful of things in there. I was like, all right, I'm packed. That's all I care about. Everything else you can get rid of. I'm totally cool with that. Of course, she also doesn't like it because I'll turn around and buy the stuff again because.
Does your laptop fit in 9 by 9 by 6? I'm thinking.
Well, that doesn't count because I don't technically own my laptop, so it's not my stuff. So, and it fits on top of the box. So, I have grown. I have acquired some things. So I think my weights are probably the one thing that I carry around. But anyway, like to identify burnout, looking for that creativity. Like if you start feeling like you're just not being creative anymore, like you're just in that rut of like the daily grind of like just get through. If you start realizing, and I think it's, the big thing is like your day job. If you start just Sunday evening dreading Monday morning, time to make a change, and it's okay. I think people get caught up in like this loyalty to a company, and I'm loyal to a point. Like I'm very loyal to the companies I work for. I try to do my best to do the best work that I possibly can. But at the end of the day, I have to take care of myself and my family first, because I'm not going to be a good employee to them. I'm not going to be a good husband to my wife. I'm not going to be a good father to my kids if I'm not happy and in a good place. You have to kind of take care of yourself. You have to make sure that you're doing the right things. I think, Chad Fowler wrote a book several years ago that talked a lot about making sure you take care of your health, making sure you're mindful of these things. Don't let your health slip, because once that starts going, you start not becoming the best person that you can be, and you start not really taking care of the things that need to be taken care of. And from a company's perspective, and I love seeing a lot of companies trying their best to look out for their employees, but at the end of the day, they're there to make money, and that's okay. They can't just give you all the things in the world. Sometimes you have to take those things and you have to say, this is something I'm doing for me. And this is, maybe it's a change of jobs. Maybe it's just a change of time, and saying, I have to put these constraints. I'm not working past 6 o'clock. I'm not working on the weekend. And if it doesn't work for that company, you say, okay, I'm sorry, I have to go find something else. Because when you're 60 or 70 or 80 years old, you're not going to look back and say, wow, I'm glad I worked that extra couple hours, that week, or that extra, I'm glad I worked 60 hours a week instead of 40. You're not. And I think that's, I've always been kind of more on the philosophy side. Like I'm not religious, but I definitely follow philosophy, and like the Taoism, which is something that I've been into since I was a teenager. I find that when I follow that path, I'm much happier. And when I say that, I mean, one of the ideas behind Taoism is that you kind of go with the flow. You don't force things in the world. You don't force, everything's going to happen. And the harder you try to force and the harder you try to work against things, the more inner struggle and the more turmoil it causes in you. Whereas if you just let things happen and understand that they're going to continue to happen, good or bad, and there's not really good or bad things. They're just things. If you get into a car accident, it's not a bad thing that happened to you. It's just a thing that happened to you. You're going to get through it as long as you're alive. It might change the way you do things, but you just get through it and you move on. Because at the end of the day, you're the one sitting there all by yourself on your deathbed, and you don't want to waste a day of it. That was dark.
How to get out of burnout. Start by thinking about your deathbed.
Exactly. Let's start by thinking about the story you want to tell when you're dead. Was the story I worked my butt off and I didn't do all the things? Or, I think, what is it? The Hunter S. Thompson, death isn't something you're supposed to slide gracefully into. You're supposed to go screeching into, madly screaming, I made it. I can't remember the exact quote. It's somewhere. I'm sure we can find it. But it's that same idea. It's like, you just have fun. Enjoy life. It's too short.
Yeah. One part of what you talked about there really resonated with me was just that idea of like waking up with something you're looking forward to. I've always found that to be like a great predictor for myself of, anytime I'm in a job and I wake up in the morning, like, oh, I have this idea and I can't wait to actually get to my desk. Like I can't stop and talk to people on the way because I just got to get this idea out of my brain. If I'm ever in that mood, it's going to be a good day of work, and everything bad might happen. Production might be on fire. Everything else in the world can be a problem. But if I'm excited about something that I want to get done and I have a chance to work on it, I'm going to feel pretty good. And generally that's when I have my most productive times at a job, and I'm doing my best work for them as well. To your point, in that kind of like when the relationship with your employer is working, it works for both sides, So I really appreciate it. And my wife has an adage that she quotes at me all the time of, if you have something that you're excited about, something that you're working on, and someone to take care of, then life's pretty good.
Definitely. Your wife is a smart woman.
I'm starting to feel burned out. No, it's just funny because, and I think some of it's from the travel, but I've been super tired the last few weeks. And yeah, just thinking about it and going, yeah, well, maybe maybe I should, because I'm going down to a conference again this weekend. It's funny, I went to Codebeam and I met you, and then I went to Podfest the next weekend in Orlando. And so this next weekend I'm going down to Las Vegas for a conference called MicroComp. And yeah, I'm seriously tempted, just thinking about this, to take an extra day and just tell everybody, look, I'm not going to pick up my phone. I'm still alive, and I'll see you when I get back.
I mean, and sometimes you have to do that. Like, just say, look, I'm not doing anything. You know, one of the things that's really helped me here recently, aside from I did need the change of jobs. That's not to say anything bad about my previous company. It's just, you know, I was trying to, it was just kind of a startup. It was a startup idea. It was, you know, try to get as much done as possible. But during that time, I got away from a lot of the things that I love doing that help keep me energized, working out, you know, eating the way I eat, you know, playing rugby, things like that, you know, all stuff. We kind of talked about it a little bit, is there's something to be said about doing something outside of work. And, you know, I always say that never work more than 40 hours for a single person. You can do side work. You can work on open source. You can do contract work. But if you're working more than 40 hours for a single company or a single person, you're giving too much of your time away. You're not able to do the things that you need to do for yourself. You're not able to do the things that you need to do for your family. Then that's not being said. I mean, obviously, if I was running a podcast, running conferences, speaking, and, you know, helping with open source and things like that, obviously I was putting more time in than 40 hours a week. But those other things are things that I wanted to do. They were things that I still enjoyed doing. There was, you know, I found great value in those, and it allowed me to go back to the 40 hours a week with like fresh perspective, like feeling like I was still moving myself forward as a person. And that's one of those things that I tell people, and I meet a lot of people coming in as new developers, and they're like, well, what advice? And that's probably the best advice I can give a new developer. Never work more than 40 hours for a single person. Obviously there's leeway in that if there's a production issue on the weekend, but even that can be worked around. Say, look, hey, I had to work 8 hours this weekend. I'm taking Monday off. You know, I mean, I'm sorry, you know, you just need to make sure you take care of yourself. I think that's the most important. And I tell you what, as far as rugby goes, I recommend it highly to go out 3 times a week and hit somebody really hard and get all that frustration out.
I got 4 brothers. I'll just go over to my mom's house.
Well, so I grew up. So I didn't have any brothers or sisters, but I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's house growing up, and it was me and my cousin and my uncle. And my uncle was only like 8 and 9 years older than us, and then my cousin was a year or two, and we fought all the time. Like wrestle, like we might get along for like a couple of hours playing something, but then at some point somebody would start a fight. And we would, you know, end up wrestling. And sometimes we would just wrestle just to wrestle. You know, it was just kind of one of those things. And so maybe that's why I like playing rugby now and all that. You know, it's like it still goes back to that. You feel like a kid running around on a field, you know, running into people, stuff like that.
Aren't you Irish by descent in some fashion?
I am. I did the ancestry, and I am like 40 something % Irish, and then the rest of it is kind of distributed, but quite a bit from like Britain. So yeah, and like I know my last name's Winn, but apparently the Winns came from the McKnights, and the McKnights came over from Ireland, and then yes. And on my mom's side, we did my maternal grandfather's, his last name is Carmody, and yeah, his family like. They're Boston Irish. So like they came, his grandmother came over from Ireland, and then they grew up in Boston, or technically it's Lowell, but up in Massachusetts. And then I think the other bit of it comes from England, is my grandmother, my mom's side. So
yeah, I feel like you got the fighting part of it honest. I lived in Ireland for like a year, and there's the joke that says an Irish guy's walking down the street and sees a couple of guys just going at it fighting, and he says, "Hey, is this a private fight or can anyone jump in?"
Exactly. The joke is we drink and fight and drink, and that's as the older I get, the less I drink, and also the less I fight. My wife is happy about both, I'm sure.
I don't know if you're like me, but when I have a new idea, I probably spend an hour looking for a domain that communicates the right thing to the right people so that they know what I'm about. And that's why I've picked up as a sponsor the .tech domains, and you should definitely check them out. There's never been a domain that's helped represent the tech community so well. And getting a domain that's relevant to your brand, that helps encapsulate the ethos of what you're doing is just, it's hard. And the .coms a lot of times are taken up, and so having a .tech is really, really awesome. Now, I have actually picked up devchat.tech. We have a lot of SEO behind devchat.tv, so it probably won't switch, but I wanted that out there so that people can pick it up and know that devchat is about tech. And I love the idea. So using a .tech domain was an awesome solution for us. It's short, it's relevant to what we do, and it just sticks in people's head. It's a natural fit for anything technology. So if you're a programmer, if you're working on a tech startup or an open source library or things like that, it's definitely a great way to go. In fact, a lot of other companies have actually been moving over to .tech. So CES, which is a conference that I go to every year, and go check out all the new technology. They switched over to ces.tech from cesweb.org. Viacom has viacom.tech to host their tech division. Intel chose insight.tech for their latest initiative. And startups on a tech domain have raised more than $1 billion on a .tech domain. So if you want your own .tech domain, go to go.tech/elixir and use the coupon code elixir.tech and get a 1-year tech domain at $9.99 and a 5-year .tech domain at $49.99. Now, if you use this coupon code to get a .tech domain, tweet at me at CMaxW and let me know what .tech domain you got so that I can shout it out on Twitter. I'd really love to see what you're doing with this, and I think it's just a great product. So go check it out at go.tech/elixir and get this deal today.
So yeah, it's there's that rough and tumble sort of thing that kind of, growing up, a bit of a fighter growing up and stuff like that, and on the edge, which is fun. I've settled down. I'm 43 now, so I have to be settled down.
All right. Well, I'm going to start pushing us toward picks.
I think Mark had something specific he wanted to go through that would be very fast.
Okay.
Also, I'd love to see, which is 5 behind the code with Johnny.
Oh,
let's do it.
Oh, 5 behind the code. I missed this. Real quick, do you know why I started the 5 behind the code? I don't know.
I'm curious. Like it was just in case people aren't familiar with it, it's like at the end of your podcast, you just kind of have these 5 completely non-technical related questions for the host or the guest, and just kind of like Star Wars or Star Trek, and just kind of like, I thought, I'd love to hear like why you started doing that and what your aim was.
So one of the things about podcasts that I had seen is, and it really open source in general and books and pretty much everything, is like we put everybody on these pedestals, like Jose Valim, he wrote Elixir, he's also a human being. He's somebody that, if you see him at a conference, and I recommend anybody walk up and say hi, and so the idea with 5 behind the code was to make these people that you only see online human, because I think that's something that is missing a lot of times, is that humanity from, and I say that obviously they're humans, but you look at it like a PR or an issue, and you almost treat them like they're robots. Like they're just no, these people have families, they have lives, they have interests, they want to do other things. And so the idea was to do the 5 behind the code to kind of, it was fun to spring it on people, because especially in like the first several episodes, nobody knew what it was, and I didn't tell them that it was happening. It was, literally, oh, by the way, hey, we're going to end this with 5 behind the code. I'm going to ask you 5 questions. You have no idea what these questions are, and they're really personal. One of my favorite, I do want to say real quick, was the John, I believe it was John Hughes show, where he got really deep. He talked about a passing in the family and stuff like that. And like, kind of like some of the emotional side, like he really can. And I was like, wow, that was pretty cool. We learned a little bit about this person that you're not going to find out on GitHub, so. But yeah, that's why I started it. And a lot of people come up to me and say that's their favorite part of the show. So
I love that. I started 3 different shows spun off of JavaScript Jabber, Ruby Rogues, and Adventures in Angular. And it's my Ruby story or my JavaScript story. And we kind of get their journey through code. But yeah, I'm also trying to highlight who these folks are as people and highlight that they came from the same kind of place that we all did. And yeah, and so I love that personal stuff because, yeah, you don't capture that anywhere else. It doesn't, there might be some fun comments in the code or something, but that's about it.
Well, and that's what Jose has told the story, and I'm using him because this is Elixir, but I'm sure there's hundreds of other ones like this. But, if you go back and listen to his talks about like the history of Elixir, it wasn't like he woke up one day and said, I'm writing Elixir and started banging on the keyboard, and all of a sudden, boom, we have this beautiful language that's there for everybody to use and share.
Way to burst my bubble.
There was a lot of ups and downs. I mean, there was a period of time where he stopped and he scrapped everything he had and started over. And I think those are the really important stories to hear for listeners sitting at home, or somebody sitting at that desk going, man, you mentioned imposter syndrome. Well, we have this imposter syndrome because we put everybody on pedestals to where we think that they just wake up and they code. And that's not the way it works. They have the same kind of struggles. They have the same kind of, thought processes they're grinding through. Erlang, even if you go back to Erlang, it wasn't like they just woke up and wrote Erlang. I mean, it was, 3 people working really hard for a number of years before they even had the first thing. Several iterations, that sort of thing. And that's 30 years old. So, I mean, people are too hard on themselves, I think, sometimes. And they expect it's all just going to come. They're going to wake up one morning and write a brand new language. So.
Well, I think with that, this is a good time to lower that pedestal a little bit. So I have a little intro music here. Jigga, 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 jigga.
Nice.
All right, so let's get some quick questions here then for you, Johnny. Best 1980s movie?
Oh, this is a tough one because I'm a kid in the 80s. I grew up in the 80s, so I have a ton of them. I can pretty much any John Hughes movie. Even like 16 Candles. I love 16 Candles. Breakfast Club. I used to watch Breakfast Club like over and over again. Honestly, in high school, I remember the first time I got Saturday detention. I stopped going after a while. I was like, this is ridiculous. But so the first time I got Saturday detention, I remember the teacher, this is not the Breakfast Club. So
nice. Solid choices. Second question. If you could go anywhere on vacation with your whole family, where would it be?
That's another good one. So we do travel a lot. And I'm sure everybody here knows I have 7 kids. So when you say whole family, do you mean whole family that's living in the house with us now, or whole family, like all of us?
Your entire nuclear family. You have to bring everyone back home and then go.
Okay. Well, I told you, I said I'm getting old. So now I think money, like how much is it going to cost? But considering money is no option, I would say I would love to do a trip. Either one of the ones that we had talked about planning was flying to Hong Kong, and there's a train that goes all around China. And so that you catch on the train at Hong Kong, you take the train all the way. It basically hits all the major cities all the way around. And then you could come back to Hong Kong and fly back. It'd take like 2-3 weeks to just explore China. I think it would be an awesome trip. So I do have like bucket list items. But I think that there's too many of those. I love the travel. That's like probably one of my favorite things.
All right. Well, speaking of bucket list, yeah, it's a perfect segue into question number 3. If you could go anywhere in the world on vacation by yourself this time, where would it be?
See, now this is hard because as much, and we kind of talk, like, I'm not about things, but I'm about people. And I like having certain people around me. And I love all my kids. Don't get me wrong. But there's something about like my wife and my two youngest. And when the older ones were younger, it would have been them, you know, but now it's like having 7 kids and having adult children. I'm getting ready to be a grandfather, by the way. Oh, that's a news story there for you. I think y'all are the first that I'm telling publicly. I'm getting ready to be a grandfather in May. That's how old I am. So, but looking back at like these, I understand that the time is limited. Like, you know, hey, if my 12-year-old daughter asked to watch a show with me on Saturday, I'm going to take advantage of that because I don't know how many more Saturdays where I'm going to have with her before she's done and like on to her own thing. You know, like she would rather hang out with her friends, you know, that sort of thing. So I don't think in terms of that, but what I can tell you is this. So I had this bucket list. My wife asked me what I wanted for Christmas one year. And I told her, I said, I want to touch a rhino. I want to swim with whale sharks, and I want to swim with humpback whales. And she was like, "That seriously? That's what you want for Christmas?" I said, well, "Just pick one. That had to be all." So I've touched a rhino. The Denver Zoo has this program where you pay $50 and you get to meet the rhino and you get to spend about an hour with the rhino and you touch them and everything like that. And it's really cool. You get to feed them if they'll sit around. It's very much you walk up to they have like a close spot. You walk up to it. And then the rhino may or may not come over to you. They try to entice him. But if the rhino doesn't want to come over, the rhino doesn't come over. But luckily he came over. And so I have a picture of everything like that. The next one that she's going to do for me is the whale shark. I think I mentioned that we were going to be moving to Southern California. And there's a place in like Northern Mexico and like Baja California area where you can go swim with whale sharks. I have to wait till my 50th to do the humpback because it's going to be like around $15,000, I think, something like it's insane expensive to go swim with humpback whales. So, is
that how she motivates you to stay healthy? You have to wait till you're 50.
Actually, you know what's funny is there's
did I just hear a young man ask an old man how he stays?
Well, so a number of years ago, I smoked cigarettes, and my wife got me to quit by buying me a snake. So yeah, a lot of stuff is tied to animals.
I'm surprised animals didn't come up in all your recommendations about learning programming. It just sounds like you use them for all sorts of things.
You know what? They're motivational. They're really cool because you don't ever have to worry about an animal. Well, I guess snakes will bite you at some point, but you know. A dog's gonna bite too. No, they seem to be nice. They're nice to hang out with.
All right, we can wrap up these last two pretty quick. Number 4, what is your dream job?
All of them.
Don't have to pick one.
Nope, I have to have all of them. My wife always jokes that we will be. I've already done a lot of jobs. I told you about the whole cat lifestyle thing where I do something until I'm bored and then I move on to the next thing. And we'll watch a segment on CBS Sunday Morning, which is probably one of my favorite shows ever. And I'll be like, I think I can do that. And she's like, no, you're 43. You're not changing careers. I'm like, no, I think it would be fun. If I was a firefighter, I could just work a couple of days a week as a firefighter. And then, stuff like that. It's like, hey, I could totally be a pilot and fly commercial airlines. I mean, why not? I mean, do you have to go to school for
that? I hope a little bit. Yeah. And last question here: who would you choose to play you in a movie about your life story?
Let's see. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, maybe. I think that he's got The Rock. Actually, we joked that The Rock and I are twins. He's a little more famous than I am, but just a little bit. I think.
Right.
Yeah, but he's the ugly twin.
Exactly, he's the ugly twin. They'd have to tone down his looks a little, or tone up his looks a little bit, I should say.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for answering those. Chuck, did you want to go to picks now?
Yeah, I think we probably ought to. But yeah, this has been fun, and it's kind of interesting to see your journey alongside Elixir's journey, Johnny.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah. Josh, do you want to start us off with picks?
Yes, I do. I have 2 picks this week, which is one more than usual. The first is both the Twitter thread and the corresponding Hacker News thread for a discussion of why blaming the software for the 737 MAX is silly. Because if you don't know where this is happening, this will be released a little bit later. A 737 MAX crashed, and it was the second one in recent weeks. And it's been widely attributed to a software error, but this thread goes through lots of other discussions. And I find it interesting because I think it's like a systems level discussion rather than finding the first why and moving on. And then the second is liquiditylang.org, which is a language that compiles to Michelson, which is the language for the Tezos blockchain. And I am both invested in and very happy with conceptually Tezos. And anyway, so Liquidity has both an OCaml style and a ReasonML style that will both compile down to the stack machine that is Tezos. So it's interesting, it's neat, and if anyone's interested in that area, it's a fun place to look for what's happening. That's it for me.
Nice. Mark, what are your picks?
Well, I have one, and I was just pulling it up, and it's been pulled down, but I can still tell you about it. I just will leave out some of the details. So we had a guest, we've had a guest on before, and on Twitter, he was talking about how he was contacted. He does Elixir Consulting, and how he was contacted by a company in the financial space. And they said, over the past time frame, we found that using Elixir for our new product has been so beneficial to our business that we now consider the use of Elixir as a major competitive advantage that we don't want our competitors to have. So please keep this inquiry private. So he posted it on Twitter, but he took out the names of the company and everything. And so now I see he's actually pulled down the whole thread. It was a beautiful thread. And so maybe they reached out to him and said, hey, that kind of like violates the spirit of what we were talking about. So I don't know. But anyway, there were Joe Armstrong was weighing in on it, and he was saying things like, yeah, years ago, there was a company that was using Erlang to great effect and in the gaming industry. And we asked them, hey, can we tell people you're using Erlang? And they said, no, we tell everyone we're using Java. And so, but that's like that. So that's awesome. I know it is. It's great. It's like, but it what's so funny to me is like that Elixir and Erlang, the Beam, it really is like this superpower, like this secret weapon, and like all these other big companies that are starting to use it don't tell anyone because they don't want their competitors to know. And so like, anyway, I wanted to share that thread, but it's been pulled down. So anyway, that was the summary of it.
Nice. Michael, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah, two quick picks. So I play around a lot with nerves, especially on nights and weekends. I have a little monthly meetup group that gets together, and we mostly just build things for our houses that are not necessary. But recently there was a group that got together and started a project called Elixir Circuits. And they're kind of trying to take, relating to our discussion earlier about dates, they're trying to take some of the things that a lot of us that are very commonly needed to be done, like talking SPI, which a lot of the sensors you get, they'll talk SPI and things like that. So that they're just trying to make those things really easy for the things that are repetitive and not very exciting, or not the areas of embedded programming that we're trying to learn. And so elixircircuits.github.io is really awesome to look at. And it's a great place also just to go look for project ideas if that's something that you want to do for fun. There's also a blog that's maintained called embeddedelixir.com. And a lot of people post stories about things that they've built and kind of how they troubleshot their way past problems. It's a really great resource, again, just for finding new ideas of projects that you might be able to pick up and do on a weekend on your own. And so I just really love that whole kind of nerves community. It's really fun. It's a very different kind of programming than what I generally get paid for. And so it's a great way to get out of my 40 hours of paid work and into something else that's more learning and play and excitement. So highly pick those.
That's funny. You You got my attention when you talked about SPI, because when I was in college at BYU, one of our classes was doing chip layout, because I was a computer engineering major. And so I was, in the engineering department. And I don't think the professor quite had a good handle on how much time it took to do the design, because I spent literally like every night until like 2 a.m. in the lab with my lab partners working on it. And we built an SPI, a SPI bus. And it was nuts. So yes, I have actually built and designed a SPI bus in my life.
Sorry, Chuck. No one else ever has to build that again now.
That's so true. Yep. Anyway, interesting. So I'm going to jump in with a few picks. So a few things that I'm going to throw out here. One is I'm heading down to Las Vegas this next week for MicroConf. Interestingly enough, I'm actually giving one of the attendee talks. It's like a 5 or 10 minute talk. And I'm going to be talking about how I do sponsorship sales for the podcast, because it's a business conference, not a programming conference. But when I go down to Las Vegas, I usually do a couple of things to get a deal. Because, a lot of the things that people go down there for are kind of lost on me. I don't drink, I don't gamble, I don't smoke. I'm not really interested in some of the more risque shows that they have down there. And the other thing is I've been down there so many times that I don't really care where I stay. So usually when I go down, I book through VRBO. So I'm going to pick that VRBO. Or the other one that I've done when down there and I don't have a place that I know I'm staying at is, I totally blanked. Oh, Hotwire, hotwire.com. And if you know the Las Vegas area pretty well, you can usually actually figure out what hotel they're going to put you in before you buy. Because Hotwire, they just say, okay, you're going to get a 4-star hotel in this area. And anyway, so that works out pretty well. I'm also going to just let people know that if you want to get a better deal, you want to stay off the strip. And you can get to the strip fairly easily, park at the casinos and get around that way. And that'll save you a bunch of hassle and money. So anyway, I'll just throw all that in. The conference I'm going to is at the Tropicana. And I actually got a deal staying at Excalibur, which isn't the nicest hotel. It actually is on the strip. But anyway, there's a lot of stuff to do down there. So I will pick Las Vegas. Johnny, do you have some picks for us?
I do. So a couple of them. The first one that I wanted to talk about was so I mentioned that we travel a lot. We actually spent like 3 months. The family spent 3 months in Europe, just kind of cruising around. One of the places we went was the Science Museum of London. They have this application you can download for Android or for your iPhone or iOS. It's called Rugged Rovers. And what it is, it's a kind of a pseudo racing game, but it allows you draw and design your car. So the idea is it's almost kind of like an evolutionary racing game where you're trying to draw optimal vehicles to try to go across this landscape to go as far as you possibly can. One of the really cool things about this is even on your phone, it's tied to the one that's in the museum. So you can either do it solo, like on your phone by yourself and just kind of race to see how far you get, or you can join the game that's happening in the museum in London at the time. And so that, everybody's drawing their cars right there in the museum and racing against you, which is kind of cool, or pretty much anywhere around the world. And it kind of falls in that genetics theme or the fitness theme. For genetics, but yeah, that's through the Science Museum of London. The other one, and actually kind of inspired by travel as well. I'm gonna, and they're not paying me, but I'm gonna talk about like Cruise America. So we're going into the summery kind of season, and I know Josh, you've done the RV thing before too. One of the best things that my family's done is, and we've done a couple like really long RV trips. They'll have a lot of like one-way deals to where you go to their site and they might say, pick up in Chicago and deliver to San Francisco. You have a month, and I think we did actually that. We took 2 weeks. it was less than $400 for the RV for 2 weeks in an RV. So it's a great, especially for families traveling and things like that. We had to fly from Jacksonville to Chicago, but we picked it up in Chicago, drove to San Francisco, got to see a lot of the country, and then flew back to Jacksonville. We're actually looking at doing it again coming up here in the next few weeks, because they always have deals pop up, like one-way deals where you get it for an extended period of time for next to nothing, because they're trying to move inventory around, which it's kind of fun going into the summer season, get out in the RV, see the country, see, where everybody's at. So there's my 2 picks.
Awesome. If people want to find you online, where do they go?
Well, you can find me at Johnny_Rugger on Twitter, or the Elixir Fountain. I still maintain that account. You can also email me, reach out to me at johnny@elixirfountain.com. So I'm pretty easy to get a hold of.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And it's definitely kind of odd being on this side of the mic. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.